Hey fellow AP Lang teachers, this is Beth Hall from Coach Hall Writes, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about some tips for teaching argument essays. Before we get started, I would love it if you would check out the description box below. There you will see a link to join my AP Lang teacher email list. I send out either weekly or bi-weekly emails full of tips and also free resources at times. So if you guys are looking for additional ways to help your students prepare for the AP Lang exam, you're definitely going to want to join that list. My first tip is something that I started doing earlier this year, and it has worked really well for my students, and that is the reasons first approach. So let me explain. Basically, in years past, as soon as I would give students a prompt, we'd talk about what the prompt was asking, and then they'd immediately start brainstorming evidence. So I use the acronym CHORES, which stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, reading, experience, and science. Now, I know there are plenty of other acronyms out there. Personally, I don't think it really matters which acronym you use because I feel like they all really achieve the same thing, but that's what we would do. We would start with evidence. However, a lot of times my students were choosing like the very first piece of evidence they came up with, and it might not have been the best evidence, or their commentary was kind of weak because they didn't really think of the implications of that evidence. So what we started doing this year is we started thinking about reasons first. So what I would do is I would ask them these sort of really open-ended, broad questions. So for example, a couple weeks ago, my students did the competition prompt, which is a prompt that I created for them. I actually made a video series about this. It's called Class with Coach Hall Writes, if you're curious. I will warn you though, there's accidentally a gap of time in the part 3 video where there's no voiceover. My apologies, but you could just skip over that part. So anyway, what I did is I gave them the prompt, which was basically, to what extent is competition unhealthy? And then what we did in class is we brainstormed different reasons why competition is healthy. So what are the benefits of competition? Why is it valuable? But then we flipped it and we also looked at why it was unhealthy or perhaps detrimental. Something else that has really helped my students this year is looking at some sample essays from the College Board first. Now, normally I would say, I don't want them to see these sample essays yet because I don't want to give them any ideas. I don't want them to copy it. But my students know these essays exist because we do look at sample essays in class at various points. And so what I did is I chose a prompt that was similar to the one that they were doing, but not the prompt they were answering. And so they did look at the prompt. I made it very clear what the prompt was, but we looked at the high scoring essays. My students tend to write at the 3 or 4 out of 6 level. I have some students who do 5 or even 6 out of 6. So we looked at the higher scoring essays with the caveat that these were very strong essays. And I didn't expect my students to all be able to write like this. However, I wanted them to learn from it. I personally am a very visual learner. And in high school, when I was preparing for standardized tests, I would look at the test books and I would read the sample essays and I would look at the scoring commentary and say, okay, that's what they want me to do. And I was able to then apply that knowledge to my writing. So because I have a lot of students who are also visual or students who just really like to know exactly what you want, they want a checklist, I thought this would be a good exercise. So what we did is we looked at the samples and we started with, what's their thesis? What are they going to talk about in their essay? What do you notice about their thesis? Because some of them maybe were a bit more simple and my students were kind of surprised, or they were maybe more open-ended and my students were like, I've never thought to write it that way. Then I had them look at the body paragraphs. So first of all, I wanted them to identify if the evidence was specific, and if so, why it was specific. Now, the high scoring essays did have specific evidence. So we talked about what the reader was looking for, why it would be considered specific, and also we looked at the layers within the paragraph. So how was that student pairing different examples in order to prove their main idea of the paragraph? I also had my students identify the transitional words or phrases that these student writers used. So we looked at it in 2 different ways, within the paragraph and between the paragraphs. So within the paragraph, I had them look at how the student writer transitioned from one layer of evidence and commentary to another layer of evidence and commentary. We also looked at the relationship between paragraphs. So how did they construct their topic sentence and even their concluding sentence? Because one of the things that my students are focusing on right now is a line of reasoning. We want to strengthen their line of reasoning. And so we had some conversations about how did they order their evidence? How did they order their paragraphs? How are they transitioning? And my students were taking some mental notes about, oh, I like how they did that transition, or that's a really cool way to organize the evidence. So I think it was really helpful. I personally am a fan of using sentence frames to help students create a stronger line of reasoning, because once students use those sentence frames, they're able to adapt it to their own writing and they rely on those frames less. So sentence frames can be really helpful, but I do think there's value in seeing other students' work. I just have to remind them that, hey, this was a really good essay. You're not always expected to do this. You don't have to be perfect all the time. We can learn from this though. Because even if you don't score a 6 out of 6, if you can apply some of these techniques, it's bound to make your essay better. If you're interested in knowing what these sentence frames look like, or you want to use them in your classroom, I will include a link to some in the description box below. Another tip is to allow students to brainstorm together. So this is something that I have been doing for years, and I think it really helps the students who struggle with coming up with evidence. So basically, I do this in a few different ways. I try to mix it up. Sometimes we'll brainstorm as a whole class, so I'll just have people share out ideas. And you can kind of tell when kids have taken the same class together, because someone might bring up an example from history, and then everybody else in the room is like, oh yeah, I remember we learned about that. So it can be a way for students to expand their knowledge and learn from each other. And also it reminds them of different things that they actually already know. Now, other times I'll have students just pair up, or depending on the number in the class, we might do a small group. But that way, some kids are able to speak up a bit more because they might not like to speak up in a whole class setting, but they do better in pairs or a small group. So that's a good way for students to learn from each other as well. I don't know about you guys, but when I was in high school, I was told never to use personal experience in my writing unless I was writing a personal narrative. So I carried that mantra over to my first few years of teaching. However, I've since changed my mind. There are often times when students can write compelling personal experience as their evidence. That being said, not all students know how to make their personal experience compelling. So that's one of my goals this year. I'm actually going to work on a video for the channel all about how to teach students how to write about personal experience more effectively, because quite frankly, depending on the prompt, a lot of times students do actually have relevant personal experience. They just need to know how to write about themselves. In seeing students attempt to write about personal experience, I've seen a couple major pitfalls that are pretty common. The first is that the students don't necessarily give enough context. They need to remember that the person reading their essay for the exam does not know who they are. So the context needs to be brief but effective. We don't need the entire backstory. However, we do need to know enough in order to understand the significance of the actual experience itself. Another really common pitfall is that some students don't choose experience that I personally would consider meaningful, or they don't examine the lesson from that experience. So they might have a good example, but they don't have enough commentary to back up, here's how this example truly fits the prompt. And usually there needs to be some sort of big picture concept or lesson that they've learned from it. We need to dig deeper into the why. So let me give you guys an example of a time when a student used personal experience and they just didn't push far enough. So in reference to this competition prompt, a student wrote about a reading competition. And basically the premise was that students in that particular school basically had to compete to see who could earn the most AR points. So AR points are when you read a book, you take a test, you get a certain number of points based on your score and the level of the book. And the top learners who had the most points at the end of the semester then got to go on a field trip. And so kids would compete to earn the most points. So this student is a lifelong reader. She loves to read. However, she gave the example of the reading competition and she said that it helped her peers learn knowledge, kind of vague, but she didn't actually examine what it meant to her. So one of the things that I wanted her to talk about is how it impacted her. Did it reaffirm her love of reading? Does she still read today even though there's no AR competition? The answer is yes. So we want to dig into that. Also, if the student is not particularly involved in other activities, maybe reading was a way for this particular person to shine. And so that was her form of competition. Maybe we could examine the implications of that. So it's not that it was a terrible example, it just maybe wasn't super strong because of how it was executed. So I gave my students a personal example to try to emphasize this point. because I played sports all through high school and college. So I told them, guys, you don't know this about me, but I was the Ivy Drive Elementary School jump rope champion in first grade. And they were looking at me like, okay, cool. Not really. And so I said, no, you guys don't understand. I had to jump the most jump rope times in 1 minute. I beat all the other first graders. And they were like, okay. And so I said, what? That's not relevant personal experience. It was a competition. I won. And then they were kind of laughing. They're like, no, but you did other competitions that were actually impressive. And so we talked about how sometimes, even though the experience might be related to the topic, it might not be compelling evidence. And part of the reason it wasn't compelling evidence is because it was a really trivial example, but also I had a student ask me, okay, Coach Hall, what did you learn by being the jump rope champion of first grade? And I looked at him and I was like, absolutely nothing. And so they were like, see, it's not relevant enough. So basically the idea is, what is the message? Now, I have had student athletes respond really well to this competition prompt because they're able to dig into the deeper meaning behind competition. How did it help them improve? How did it help their persistence? Things like that. So if you have a lot of student athletes or just competitive kids in general, that prompt is actually really approachable. If you are about to introduce argument, or maybe your students are kind of in a rut and you're trying to reinforce different argumentation skills, it can be a good idea to give students these fun prompts. So I like to do it either as bell work, I'll put a question on Google Classroom and I'll require that they have to respond to each other, or sometimes we'll have an actual debate. That can be really fun. So there's different prompts. My students really liked the one, is a hot dog a sandwich? Because a lot of them had to define what a sandwich was. So it was reinforcing that particular rhetorical choice. But also another one that was really popular with my students was basically, which fast food restaurant has the best fries? There were a variety of opinions on that particular topic. So there are plenty of other prompts out there. Some of them involve pictures, like there's one, how do cats wear pants? Or how does a giraffe wear a tie? So those can be good as well. And even though they might not be super serious, they can reinforce how to argue. Thank you guys so much for watching. And again, don't forget to check out the description box below. There you will find a link to my AP Lang teacher email list and also to those sentence frames I mentioned. Until next time, happy writing.